Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining. I can see there's quite a lot of participants joining us now. We've been really lucky this evening to be joined by Fiona Lovett, Gina Barnhurst and Joe Henry for our Best Practice at Lambing Time webinar. So I'm going to hand you over to Fiona now, who's going to lead the presentation. If you do have any questions, please could you use the Q&A box rather than the chat, and we'll try and get as many questions answered at the end as we can. So thanks. Over to you, Fiona.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma, and welcome to everyone. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Joe from Black Sheep Farm Health and Gina from Cos County Vets, talking about best practice at lambing time. So presumably it's something that most people are just getting ready for, if not already in the swing of it. Here we go. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about where we've come from, because there's been a lot of changes in the last 5 years, as everyone will be quite aware. How were things? What do we think good practice looks like? What do we know about the situation at the moment, and whether that's to do with antibiotics or iodine or feed or whatever it is? What do we know about the situation at the moment, and what are our options on sheep farms? And then some suggestions about how to put it into practice. So both Joe and Gina and myself, we're working with sheep vets. We're working with sheep farmers all the time, and so between us, we've got some examples and what we think works and why we say what we do. So, cracking on, where have we come from? And we know we've had. We always go back to published papers, but you know, everybody knows what the situation was on your farm within your areas this was reported in 2017. So about 6 years ago, vet students from the University of Edinburgh on their lambing placements were reporting 68% of flocks using oral antibiotics, so dosed down a mouth of baby lambs, and a quarter of flocks, 26%, were also using injectable antibiotics. Not necessarily on every lamb, but that was the data that came back from those flocks. Then some further work about the same sort of time from a PhD student, Eliana, looking at farmers supplying lambs to one of the big supermarkets. And we did 2 surveys in 2 subsequent years. So in 2016, on Eliana's work, a quarter of farms were giving oral antibiotics to every lamb born. By 2017, it was 18%, not 26. It was starting to become people suggesting it wasn't the best thing to do. That might have affected how people answered. And also in those surveys, we asked people who were using tablets, pills or tablets. So we know there are no antimicrobials licensed for sheep. So any tablets are an absolute definite no-no, and I know people will have been given them by their vets in the past. Historically, they're licensed for dogs and cats. They are not licensed for sheep, and we cannot justify in any situation giving antimicrobial pills or tablets to lambs. But you can see back only 5 years ago, 10% of farmers were saying they were doing that. So we know it has been an issue, and this part of this is about where we're moving on to. So the other thing with RUMA and the work we're doing looking at antibiotics, we could track sales of oral antibiotics, and back in 2016 it was 11.5 million doses in the UK. By the time we got to 2021, just 2 years ago, we were down to 5.5 million. We were quite pleased with that, and we were quite pleased as well that we'd managed to do it gradually and with no reports of any issues with animal welfare, and yeah, it wasn't too traumatic. Once the product was taken off the market, which as many people realize it was last year, then there have been some dramatic changes for people, and that's one of the reasons we're having this webinar. So let me just go back and just speak to Gina. Gina's younger than the rest of Joe and me, and can't remember the days when lots of antibiotics are given. Maybe I'll go straight to Joe. You can remember it, can't you, Joe?
Absolutely. It was sort of 25 years ago when I started, considered best practice to be, making sure every lamb's had its dose of antibiotics. Same with wormers. We thought it was the right thing to do to try and give every lamb a wormer.
And that's the reality, isn't it? People did it for the right reasons. Vets, that was, as you say, considered the thing to do if you had a bacterial infection, that you treated everything antibiotics. It's only since then we've realized the big problems that's caused us. And we've all made changes, and you all have made changes in what you tell people, Joe, presumably.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So change from a sort of blanket use to targeted to is it needed at all. So when we say targeted, either due to the weather, so if it's been wet for 3 days and everything's getting damp in the shed, or just triplet lambs or just gimmer twins, things like that, to trying to go sort of with none at all, and see how that goes, see how long you can go without doing any. We've also in our practice had a fairly big shift to moving to lambing outside, or certainly lambing part of the flock outside. So I think that works. Fiona's going to be talking later about the importance of nutrition and then following on from that colostrum. But I think spring grass is a tremendous feed for colostrum, and labour costs are only going up and up, and actually being able to recruit decent labour is harder and harder. So we've found that by shifting management, it's actually meant less demand for the drugs anyway. You're not propping up a system with drugs because you've changed the system.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Joe. That's really helpful. And this is just one practice. This is Rachel Foster's practice market vets down in Devon, and this just shows 10 farms and the difference between 2017 in the blue and 2021 in the pink, and for each of these farms the difference between the amount of antibiotic they were using compared to what they were using in 2021, particularly at lambing time. Quite a significant change, 75% reduction. So we've come a long way, and changes have been made right across the country. So Joe's up in Northumberland, this work here down in Market Vets down in Devon. So what does good practice look like? And Joe just sort of referred to that. You will have seen this slide before, or a number of you will have done. And we're talking about, let's start in the middle, plan ahead. So if you have got ewes inside and you're feeding them, and actually so much depends on the forage because they're ruminants. So we will always analyze forage for clients and work out what diet they need. We'd make sure that it is crucial how much they eat, but it takes a bit of planning. And arguably now, 3 weeks into January, in fact, someone phoned me just today with their diet, with their forage, and we're not too late, but will be in the next few weeks, because we need to give ourselves 6-8 weeks before lambing to sort the diet. And planning ahead in terms of monitoring colostrum, planning ahead in terms of keeping good records, knowing what the situation is. So that's plan. Prevent, we need to prevent anything that's unnecessary, whether that's cold conditions, whether it's a dirty lambing shed, dirty equipment, dirty hands, untrained people who don't know what they're doing. So we need to prevent disease by making sure the hygiene's good, that everything's disinfected, and that there's no drafts, wet bedding, that sort of thing. And so plan, prevent, and then protect. So we want to protect the lambs with colostrum. And the way we can protect them with good colostrum is to make sure the ewes are both fit and fed well. So they're the right body condition score, they're fed a good diet, their vaccinations are up to date, they're not lame, they're not spreading bacteria, foot rot bacteria, that they're clean. And so plan, prevent, protect, just about making sure everything in the lambing shed is as good as we can. So hopefully that sort of summarizes where we are with good practice. And a lot of it depends on getting a full battery full of colostrum into that lamb as early as possible. So when we get lambs with watery mouth, it basically they suck on a wet piece of wool or a mucky bit of straw and get E. coli into their guts before they've got colostrum. And if they get colostrum in there first, we do not have a problem. And you will have, if anyone has not heard the phrase colostrum is gold, we have been talking about it. I don't expect you to be able to read all of this slide, but it's just this, and these are quite old now. They're either tweets, social media, magazine articles, and basically all the industry, all the sheep sector industry have been on board with colostrum is gold, and it really is. We did so don't worry about reading all of that. It's just there's a lot of noise before lambing each year about how good colostrum is, and we did a bit of research just the year before last in Wales. In the height of the pandemic, we sent 147 of these Brix refractometers to farmers in Wales and asked them to look at the colostrum of 20 ewes, so 10 at the beginning of lambing and 10 at the end of lambing. So not too arduous, but it meant we got colostrum values. The Brix refractometer is a very quick and easy way to read the quality of the colostrum, and we did that for nearly 1,300 ewes. So it meant we could look at colostrum compared to the rations, we could look at colostrum compared to the farms, the type of ewe, and it basically showed us that 3/4 of the samples of ewe colostrum was really, really good. We know that ewe colostrum is the best thing for a lamb to get at the beginning of their life. They don't need antibiotics. They do definitely 100% need colostrum. That makes all the difference. I would say a Brix refractometer is possibly the most important thing on the in the lambing shed. Maybe that's a bit unfair, actually. It's a very useful tool, and it's only about 20 quid. The other really useful tool that we've increasingly got clients using is actually a pump to help milk the ewes. Everyone who I know who's got one thinks it's brilliant and will always use it. I know Gina and Joe maybe don't have clients all using them. I'm not trying to sell it, but I do know that when people have bought them, they realise how brilliant it is and compared to milking out ewes. What are your top tips for colostrum, Gina?
So yeah, I mean, sort of going on from this, so one of the massive benefits of something like the Easy Milker there is obviously that things are done really cleanly. What you don't want to do is obviously inadvertently, while you're trying to do a good thing, giving the lambs colostrum, actually give them really what essentially ends up being bacterial soup. So actually collecting the colostrum in a very clean manner is vitally important. And then how you store it. Again, you know, some of the bacteria that can be found in colostrum, really just from sort of bacteria on the teat end and things like that, can multiply very, very quickly if the colostrum isn't stored properly. So your general rule is, you know, cool it down as quickly as possible. It can be stored in the fridge for up to 24 hours, but if you're going to store it for longer than that, it really needs to go into the freezer. And at that point, it can be stored sort of safely up to a year. So if you're worried about storing colostrum, you can do that. But the important thing is not to milk it, leave it in a jug on the side by the sink in the shed or whatever, collecting flies, collecting bacteria, and then hoping that's going to do the lamb some good. So, be careful not to do a bad thing whilst you're trying to do a good thing. I think would be my top tip. Keep it really nice and clean.
That's a really good point, thank you. We just had a question about the ideal Brix reading for colostrum, and for sheep it's 26.5%. It's actually higher than you want for a cow, so at least 26%, which is virtually at the top of your Brix. Have you got any top tips for colostrum, Joe?
Really, just obviously it's a lot is to do with the protein quality in the diet as well as quantity, I think. And in the past I've been very keen on soya, and people using really good quality silage, 11ME silage, and then can get away with no cake just using soya. We've sort of gone off soya for environmental reasons, but unfortunately haven't quite found that anything that's quite as good, although beans seem to be doing a pretty good job. But yeah, I think a lot of that is making sure your parasites are under control, so they're not sucking, there's no fluke or worms sucking protein out of these ewes, and making sure that they're getting enough protein. And if they get enough protein, the colostrum generally follows on and is good.
Yeah, brilliant. And so it's energy really for the last 6 weeks of pregnancy, but it's protein for the last 2 weeks, definitely. And we would find a lot of diets that were deficient in protein, but you really cannot afford to be deficient in protein for the last couple of weeks of pregnancy. And I would agree with you there, Joe. I'm a big fan of beans. When it comes to ewe diets, it doesn't have to be soya. So what else do we know? We know that antimicrobials are becoming increasingly resistant. This report, this is a tiny excerpt from a letter sent to the Vet Record in 2015 from a good colleague of ours, Emily Gascoigne and Michael Miller. And I know full well that this farm where they found multi-resistant E. coli, they do know they cannot lamb ewes indoors, and they haven't been able to since they basically found there was no antibiotic that worked. I think it was fairly intensive lambing, and basically they have to lamb outside. So that's 7 years ago, arguably before we were all really talking about this. And actually this graph here is also talks about susceptibility of E. coli, excuse me, susceptibility of E. coli recovered during lambing. Joe, can you just talk through this graph, because I'm just choking.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically this is just showing the different farms and the susceptibility of E. coli, which is watery mouth causing bacteria, to those different drugs. And you can see there that you know, some of the farms that have got pretty high resistance to nearly all the drugs, the different colors there. So amoxicillin, clavulanic acid, that green is commonly known as Sinulox and such like. And you can see that those, you know, farm 9 has yeah, there's multi-resistance.
Brilliant, thank you. I knew you'd be able to step in there. Yeah, you would not want to be farm 4 or farm 9. There is very little options there, and some of these antibiotics labeled are really high priority ones for humans that we do not want to be using. Even those are not working on these sheep farms. So that's one indication of how bad things could get. Every year we have the VARS report published. It's published around November for the previous year, and this is just looking at different antibiotics along the bottom, and the percentage of resistant isolates. So it's looking at E. coli in neonatal lambs in the UK, and the colours are purple is 2019, 2020 and 2021 is the red. And you can see, so spectinomycin, pretty much over 40% resistance to those bacteria, to those antibiotics. Tetracycline, so oxytetracycline, for example, 50% resistance to E. coli. So that means out of those sampled, 50% of the time, it doesn't matter how much of that tetracycline you give those bacteria, they do not die. They survive it. So it's really important. This little graph here, these are the really important high priority antibiotics that we need to reserve for people. And we've got much lower levels, but still some resistance on sheep farms. That's where we're coming from. That is really serious. So unfortunately, the same antibiotics that we use in animals are the ones that our doctors will be using for, you know, when our children, our parents go into hospital ourselves. If you have an operation, it's the same antibiotics that are used in people as in animals. So what are the rules? What are the core rules for your sheep farm? So we all want to be keeping lambs alive, but there are very important sort of basic rules that we're all following. We held this same webinar for vets a couple of months ago, so vets are prepared and have, you know, sort their stocks out a month or two before lambing. And the core rules are: number one, focus on the plan, prevent, protect, as we spoke before, focusing on colostrum, good nutrition, body condition score, and good hygiene at lambing. Most important, more than anything else. Second core rule is that it is never appropriate to routinely give antibiotics just in case. So if you've not started lambing yet, you do not know whether you will need antibiotics this year or not. You cannot make a decision before lambing starts that you are going to give antibiotics to your lambs. It may be that you can target, your vet will advise you to use targeted antibiotics within a group that's at risk, but you can't decide that before lambing starts. You don't know. But Gina, Joe, do you want any, just firstly on these three core rules, any comments?
I think, yeah, I mean, definitely this sort of routine sort of just in case thing, you know, by no means are any of us trying to suggest that antibiotics never have a place in the lambing shed. You know, sort of our world is not a perfect world, but it's this this real thing of sort of trying to wait and see what happens and managing the situations appropriately. And, you know, as Fiona says, it's not this, you know, if you've got sort of people helping you at lambing or whatever, sort of telling them that every lamb gets this and every lamb gets that. It's definitely, you know, try and be positive, hope for the best, you know, manage the situations you can manage, and then respond to the situation accordingly. I think rather than trying to preempt things that are going to happen. I think, yeah, it's definitely just, it's just so important that it's not something that we're all doing routinely anymore.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and just, I think we'll come on to it later, but you know, it's not appropriate to give 1,000 lambs antibiotics if only 10 are going to get watery mouth. You know, it's that sort of benefit to everyone's health compared to, you know, what is an acceptable loss, as it were. No one wants anything to die, but you know, there'll be more lambs than that laying on in most indoor lambing systems. But the focus on colostrum, just a little bit about blood testing. We're quite big fans of doing that metabolic profiling 3 weeks pre-lambing, especially for silage feeders, because silage is so variable. And I think, you know, the testing it is absolutely good guide, but by actually bleeding some ewes, you can tell what they're making of that silage and how much supplementation they may or may not need, and base that nutrition, you know, actually put some numbers on that nutrition. And at the same time, the vet can condition score the ewes, and you can have a talk about body condition score and things like that, which is always useful.
And when exactly are you doing your metabolic profiles, Joe, for your standard flocks?
About between 3 and 2 weeks pre-lambing. If it's too much further than 3, that's 3 weeks from the start of lambing, and try and get ones that are due to lamb in the first week, you know, if they're being keel marked. So if it's too far out from lambing, they're not on that metabolic knife edge enough. And if it's too close by the time you get the results back, although we're looking at doing them in-house this year, there's sometimes not enough time to change things.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's a good point. So there are our core rules, and we have stressed the colostrum, nutrition, body condition score. I know there will be people watching who say, we do everything we can and we still have problems. We still want our vet to prescribe something, and if you do have problems, that's where this targeted use is. And currently there is no licensed oral antibiotic for lambs in the UK. So what we have done is we're having to talk vets through the order to make those decisions on what you can do. So there is a very clear guidance that Sheep Vet Society and the Sheep Antibiotic Guarding Group, we wrote back a year ago, and we've updated it, and it's written for vets. We've got a summary of it on the next slide, but bear in mind, any antibiotic you use for your sheep has to be prescribed by your own vet. None of the three of us are in a position to advise people who are not our clients about what antibiotic is prescribed for your situation. So your vet definitely knows you best, and legally we can't prescribe it anyway. So, but the core rules still count. Any administration must be as on the data sheet. Nobody must be giving an injectable antibiotic orally. That's not acceptable. And then the vets have to use the cascade. So on a case-to-case basis, and under exceptional circumstances, they can either prescribe something that's not suitable, that's not authorized, suitable but not authorized in that species, and they may be able to import antibiotics as well. So this is a summary of the guidance that we've given the vets, and it works in a way. We'll start with the bottom, because the bottom is the most important thing for every single one of us, that if it's an antibiotic in the red, there is absolutely no way it should be prescribed for sheep. So antibiotic tablets authorized for small animals do not have a license for food producing animals. So nobody should be giving tablets to lambs. Nobody should be using any of these drugs. So Baytril, Mibacil are the trade names. Those are restricted, high priority, critically important antibiotics. So we cannot be using those. Well, arguably, your vet still has the right to prescribe them, but they have to go through very strict conditions of taking samples and being able to justify it. And they really do have to have contemporary samples and be able to justify it before they can use high priority, critically important. And then this group of drugs, gentamicin, topramycin, and amikacin, these are reserved for human use for things like meningitis, serious brain surgery. Any one of us who cares about friends, family, we want these drugs to be useful for when we've got relations who need to go into hospital. We cannot use them. Certainly the pig industry used gentamicin a few years ago, and there was a very small levels, but they got in a lot of stick with some of the pressure groups because it's something we want to reserve for humans. So please do not use any of the medicines in the red, and that's a please as much to the vets who are prescribing them as it is to farmers who need to have drugs, antibiotics prescribed through the vets. So then as we go up, I mean, the whole table, we'll go back to the top now. This is the order that you're going through your vet's mind in prescribing antibiotics. And the D class is they need to be used with prudence, but it's the class where they need to have the least number of decisions about, are they licensed in sheep? Are they licensed, how are they given? Arguably, if you're preventing watery mouth, an oral is more helpful, but we're trying not to give them for preventative reasons. We're trying to only give them for treatment reasons. And then you go down and you can see, as we go down into the orange, there's potentially your vet has to go through more hoops before they're in a position to be able to prescribe them to you. It's slightly complicated table because it's got so many different products in there. I don't know whether Gina or Joe wants to make any comments. No pressure.
I don't really have much to add, I don't think, Fiona, but yeah, sort of that's why your vet won't just be reaching for something, some exciting antibiotic that used to be allowed a lot of, because this is what they're working through. It's not them being sort of difficult or whatever. It's for, it's for human safety as much as animal safety.
And that's a really good point. And it's a really hard decision for vets as well. And there are several hoops to have to jump through. So because the cascade, because if there's not that antibiotic license for sheep, we have to go to through certain procedures before we can make that decision. So this SIC means it's being imported from abroad, so it may be licensed in lambs in a different country, and then it's being imported. That still has to happen on a case-by-case basis. No one's allowed to import in bulk. They have to be for your flock. So that's why it's a complicated decision. Okay, but please do send your vets to the guidance and they can work through it. I'm going to go to you, Gina, now, and because you've had a few farmers where you wanted you to give them oral antibiotic last year. I think this one was last year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Talk us through what some of your clients said last year.
Yeah, so we've got sort of a couple of real life examples. These are real farms, they're commercial farms. There's sort of, I think we've got two examples here. One lamb about 500, one lamb about 300. One of them's due to start actually in the next couple of days this year. They both lamb inside. Both of them had historically been giving all of their lambs an oral dose of antibiotic. And so obviously last year, when that was no longer available, understandably, they were quite concerned. And I do appreciate that people have good reason to be concerned, about the withdrawal of these antibiotics from the market, because a lot of people have experienced horrible outbreaks of watery mouth. It's devastating, it's depressing, we can't shy away from that. And that's why, historically, when it was best advice to be giving people antibiotics to give their lambs, I understand why people snapped up that idea, because if it could prevent something, a horrible outbreak of watery mouth that they've experienced in the past, I understand why people went for that. But obviously now sort of times have changed, we know a lot more about it, and then hand in hand with that, obviously no longer having a licensed oral antibiotic available means that we have to think much more carefully about these things. So this first example here, when I spoke to them last year, they were really very concerned. So it says here, when we were told we wouldn't have Spectam available, I was filled with apprehension. If we were going to get high lamb losses, then all of the hard work that they'd put in all through the year would be wasted and the profits eaten into. I can appreciate in most situations margins are tight already. But they made some changes. They sort of took the advice on board and made some changes. The biggest thing they did was more frequent mucking out of pens. So they were able to have somebody else in to help them, so a little bit more labour. And they were absolutely sort of fastidious about cleaning out pens between ewes going into them. And they found not only obviously did that help, they didn't think they really had any cases of watery mouth last year, having previously thought it necessary to give every lamb a dose in case of having watery mouth. But actually they found, they were really quite proud of the cleanliness of their lambing shed. And when it came to the end of lambing, they were no longer faced with, 6 weeks worth of muck and straw and filth. And actually the end of lambing was much easier for them to deal with, and they felt that overall it was a hugely positive change that they'll be taking forward with them. It did come with a little bit of extra cost and a little bit of extra time, but overall they felt they had a very successful lambing, having been really quite worried about it. And they were proud of what they'd achieved and proud of the condition of their lambing shed. And then I don't know if we got another example, Fiona. So yeah, and so this is another one. Again, very worried. Had actually wondered if they would have to lamb outside in the future, which, although is can be a positive change, a lot of people can make. For them, it wasn't something they were particularly keen on the idea of. And again, they know full well that year on year things do change. They do think that the good weather that they had sort of around their lambing last year did help. They could get lambs turned out very quickly. But again, they had extra cleanliness within the pens. They were using a powder disinfectant in the pens, and they were making sure that all triplets had colostrum supplementation. And again, they think they had one loss to watery mouth last year, having previously been concerned that they may have very, very high losses, and they're, you know, much more confident moving forward again. So you know, these are real examples. These are not people that have, you know, all the way along never used antibiotics. They have gone from very heavy usage of antibiotics to basically none, and with a little bit of extra effort in other areas have really made a success of it.
Brilliant, thank you there, Gina. I'm just going to use this opportunity. Actually, we've had a couple of questions, one of which was about the use of beans in a diet as opposed to soya. I don't have any problems at all feeding beans as long as I've got in a diet fermentable energy in the rumen balanced with effective ruminal degradable protein. I do not think there's anything magic about DUP in the diet, so I don't have any problem not feeding soya to sheep as long as there's beans or other sources of protein and that's well balanced. There's another one here for you, Joe, specifically about the time scale and cost involved in metabolic profiling.
Yeah, so time scale is important. As said, you know, it wants to be about that 3 weeks before the start of lambing. And the results, if you take the bloods on sort of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you often get the results back by the end of that week. It's clearly a total waste of time if you're not going to get back from a fortnight. So depending on which lab your vets use, that needs to be sorted out in advance. But they are aware this metabolic profiling at time is of the essence. So if you send them to Dairy Herd Health Productivity in Edinburgh and things, they're quite good at turning those around. And they're round about 300 quid for 20 samples. So often I do 6 triplets, 6 twins and 6 Gimmer twins. Something around that, which it's only 3 lambs really. And so it's money well spent. And as I say, it's the only way of working out, because you can have the best ration in the world and things should be doing great. And then if you start lambing and the ewes don't have enough milk, it's too late. So sometimes we found that they've got a new baler and actually the silage, they're not able to take as much silage out because it's been put too tight in the bale. So on paper, the ration looks great. They've got everything, and yet they're still short in protein and energy and energy, and they test for both because they're physically not able to pull out the silage from the bale as easily, and things like that, which you wouldn't know necessarily just from looking at the analysis of the silage and working out how much you know each sheep should be getting.
That's interesting, you know, yes, because I do more sorting out and spend a lot more time early on doing the diets and less on metabolic profiling, but it's really dependent. You can never send somebody a diet without getting them to check exactly what they are eating, and also that the forage quality is what the analysis is, because sometimes the analysis can be a one-off, or you know they change batch, you know, go on to a second cut or a different clamp during feeding, and we need to get an analysis again. So that's a good point there, Joe. Or you know, to make it as a backup, then the metabolic profiling, if you either haven't done the diet or if you want to check that the diet's working, brilliant option. There's another question here about time it comes back, but we're not talking about mineral profiling here so much as metabolic. So what do you test, Joe? Beta hydroxybutyrate,
and albumin and urea, basically. You know, yep. Sometimes glucose as well, but it's not. We don't tend to do like the magnesium and things because it's so tightly controlled, and you tend to know what's happening there. So yeah, basically it's just the ketones and the 2 measures of protein, the short term and the long term. One thing to bear in mind, your vets should know this, is don't get them to come and blood test them at 9 in the morning, half an hour after you've fed all the ewes, if you're in a cake sort of system, because that will automatically put all the ureas, which is a short-term protein, into. It's probably best to do it late morning or early afternoon. Becomes quite tricky in our practice to fit them all in, to get them away into the post before 4:30. but it's normally doable with a bit of planning.
Great, thank you. There's another question here about, if you remember the graph we showed with antibiotic resistant E. coli on the farm, and the person's asking what options would you have if you're a farm 4 or farm 9. So if you've got multi-resistance in bacteria on the farm, the option is you are unlikely to be able to continue lambing sheep intensively inside. So you have got to make sure you've done everything really, really well, because you cannot treat disease for that bacteria when it comes along. There is no option in terms of antibiotic treatment if you have multi-resistance, I'm afraid. So all the more reason for going through what we're doing and making sure you do something before you get to that situation, or doing as Joe says, and you can only lamb outside, which we know is less intense on for disease. Is simpler. It's not simpler, but it's less. You're less likely to be in a contaminated environment. Certainly, when the weather turns, you've got other issues, but you deal with those. These are some slides from a colleague of ours, Shaminder, who just similar to Gina's case studies. This is just one flock of 750 ewes, where before 2017 every lamb was always dosed with an oral antibiotic at lambing time. From 2017 onwards, they only dosed the twins, the triplets, and then in 2021 and 2022 they only dosed those that were born at night, twins, triplets, and lambs born to tegs or shearlings, only overnight. And then last lambing they didn't dose any lambs at all, and yet they only saw 10 cases of watery mouth in what would have been well over 1,000 lambs. So 1,000 lambs, as Joe pointed out before, 1,000 lambs, if you're dosing every single lamb, is 1,000 doses of antibiotic. That to justify, it's dreadful when we lose a lamb, but the reality is, I think, was it you who pointed out, Joe, that you have more than 10 lambs laid on? It doesn't justify.
Yeah, often it's that sort of amount might be laying on. So you could say, well, let's make every lambing pen 8 foot by 8 foot to reduce the amount of lambs laying on. But realistically, you've got to stop somewhere, and I think that's the same with a
trade-off.
Yeah, exactly. That's a trade-off.
Okay. One of the questions is, what about, are probiotics effective, or are they a waste of money? And I'm just going to speak with your vet. So we've got a possibility of E. coli vaccination, not licensed in this country, but people have imported E. coli vaccination. You need to vaccinate the ewes before lambing. We don't have a lot of good trial work about vaccination, but some vets have said it works well. There's a possibility of probiotics. There's a possibility of some other pills, not antibiotic pills, but to prevent issues. We've done a few limited trials. We don't have good data, but this was probiotics. So one twin was treated, one twin was not treated, and we looked at daily live weight gain for the first 8 weeks. There wasn't obvious disease on this farm. There was no difference in the twin that had the probiotic to the one that didn't. On this farm, there was no obvious. This was 3 farms. Apologise. There were 3 farms, but there was no obvious disease. We also looked at a tablet that's used quite widely on 6 different farms last year, and on some farms, arguably, they would say that was great that the lambs that had a tablet got less cases of watery mouth than the lambs that didn't. So here, this pale blue farm had 6% of cases that not given a tablet, only 4% in cases that did. Exactly the opposite in this yellow farm, and we got many more cases in the double the cases in the ones given a tablet compared to the ones that didn't. It doesn't tell you a lot, except I have yet to see good convincing evidence that that any of these are worth doing. I would love the vaccination to work. I'd love to be able to vaccinate the ewes before lambing, and we just need more work done on it. I know, yeah. So some people in this trial very definitely thought it was a waste of money. Some people stopped the trial before they finished because they saw more problems in the ones treated, and some people still say maybe it did work and want to pay the money. we don't have the evidence, I'm afraid. I don't know whether Joe or Gina want to say anything about probiotics.
I think the big thing is that, I mean, you know, there is no concrete evidence about them, but I think, you know, most of us can agree that most of these probiotics and things on the market are unlikely to cause harm as such. But, you know, if you are going to use them, please be incredibly careful how you give them, because again, like we were talking about with colostrum, that you're trying to do a good thing, but if you're not careful, it's bacteria laden. The same can be said for a lot of these things. So if they're pills and you're ramming them down throats with filthy fingers, or they're pump bottles and they're just being pumped from lamb to lamb to lamb, actually that's a great vehicle for transporting bacteria. And, you know, I know a lot of people have used oral antibiotics with a pump and got away with it because obviously it's an antibiotic, it's killing bacteria that are present. And so do just be really careful if you go down a route of using a probiotic to do it again with really, really high hygiene standards, because otherwise, as shown in some of these cases, potentially that's why that you can just be very effectively transporting bacteria between animals.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Gina. Let me just, in terms of numbers, this relates a bit to something you were saying, Joe. Well, we'll start off with, so this is just some data I got from 125 farmers. We've got a few more. We could have done some questions on this webinar, actually. We've got a bit more data. So when we ask people what they're most worried about, it's almost in quarters, isn't it? People worried about watery mouth, people worried about joint ill, ewes not having enough colostrum. There's plenty of other things for us to worry about, whether that's numbers of staff or the weather or whatever. A few people concerned about lambs getting scour. So I think it's always quite worth asking. So a lot of the antibiotics, they're licensed to prevent lambs getting scour. Actually, that's a small number. When we ask these same farmers actually about watery mouth, which was a big concern, sort of people thought they were worried about it. When we actually said, how many cases did you get in the previous year? A quarter of the people there had no lambs at all had a case of watery mouth. A further 44% had less than 1% of lambs. So less than 5 lambs out of a flock, out of 500 lambs. So 300 or 400 ewes. And then about a third of farmers had between 1 and 10% of lambs, had between 1 and 10% of lambs with watery mouth. When we were trying to do the trials last year, looking for farms with high levels of watery mouth, a lot of people said they had high levels of watery mouth. By the time we actually did the trial, there wasn't any watery mouth. I think the perception in it being a problem is often worse than the reality. And that brings me on to what questions you ask your clients when you're talking about watery mouth, Gina.
Yeah, so as you say, this sort of leads quite nicely on, because I think often the first question that you need to either ask yourself or that I'll ask my clients is, you know, if they ring up saying, I've got a problem with watery mouth, well, quantify it for me. How big a problem is it? And as Joe said as well, you know, comparing it to lambs being lain on, or lambs drowning in water buckets, or lambs being, you know, predated on if it's outside and things, you know, I massively appreciate every lamb is very important, but when we're comparing that loss of, you know, a couple of lambs or a low percentage of lambs compared to, you know, vast risk of antibiotic resistance and things. It's, you know, we need to try and put it in perspective. So 1 or 2 lambs in a large flock, in my mind, certainly doesn't justify sort of rushing to the antibiotics. So comparing it to other issues and quantifying it as perhaps a percentage of your total expected lamb crop, etc., is try and sort of quantify how big a problem it really is. Then look at the things that, you know, what can you control that might make the situation better. So obviously some things you can't control. You can't control the weather. You can't instantly change the facilities that you've got, or, you know, that sort of thing. But actually, could you increase the frequency that you muck out the pens? Could you add in an application of a disinfectant? Is your hand hygiene and wearing of gloves and disinfecting of tubes and teats and things like that, is it as good as it could be? Are you able to improve any of those things? You know, is every lamb having its navel dressed ASAP and twice if needed, etc.? Then have we definitely got the right diagnosis? And I sort of, that's perhaps not quite the right way of wording it, because I less mean, is it definitely watery mouth? Because in most instances, you know, you can see that clinically. A lot of farmers are very aware of what watery mouth looks like. But, you know, especially if you're a farm that has used antibiotics in lambs in the past, and even more so if you're suspicious that, you know, in later years, perhaps you are still having cases of watery mouth despite treatment, you know, do we need to look at taking samples? Can we do culture and sensitivity? So can we grow the bacteria that's present and look at you know, which antibiotics will actually work against them? So if we are having to reach for the antibiotics, we're reaching for the most appropriate one, both in terms of that chart we were looking at earlier with the sort of green, amber, red, but also in terms of what's actually going to work on the bacteria you've got on your farm. So once we've sort of dealt with all of this, and, you know, if needed, antibiotics have been prescribed, or actually if we're looking at a very low level of cases and there's other management type things we can change, then I encourage people to sort of reflect back on it. So certainly not in the heat of the moment when things are quite stressful, but after lambing's finished, or when things have calmed down, you know, sort of again about the things that we can control. Is there anything you would or could change ahead of next year? You know, was the ewe nutrition right? Did you do bloods pre-lambing so you knew you were getting the feed right? You know, did they lamb in the right body condition score? Did all lambs get sufficient colostrum? How was that measured? You know, was that hygiene as good as it could be? Are there things you can tweak ahead of next year that might just help you get on top of things? So, you know, as I've said before, there is nothing wrong with using appropriate antibiotic treatment in the lambing shed, but only if it's needed. And so we need to sort of work through these questions really before before myself or any other vet start prescribing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gina. And presumably you're asking similar questions, Joe. Have you got anything to add to that?
No, I think that's very comprehensive from Gina. The only thing I would ask is, you know, is it possible for them, as I've said, to change the management to potentially lambing, say, the twins outside, which massively reduces the number of sheep in the shed, which reduces the humidity, the general bugs and stuff in the shed, and the labour bill, which tends to knock all these problems into cocked hat in terms of if you're paying labor at £10 a lamb, which isn't that unusual for our farms, and you can then lamb outside and have one shepherd to 1,000 as opposed to one person in the lambing shed per 200 ewes, you know, that's a massive saving, and generally it's less disease.
Yeah, there's a question there about lambing inside versus outside, and I think the balance is disease control versus weather conditions, isn't it? Those are the kind of big things to weigh up, but very helpful.
You know, indoor lambers, if they're you know, there's quite a few of ours at indoor lambers rearing 1.65, 1.7 lambs, and not that many more per ewe tucked. You know, they're still losing quite a few, even though they're lambing inside. We've got outdoor lambers rearing very similar numbers, maybe not quite as high as 1.7, but sort of certainly into the 1.6s comfortably, but with a lot lower cost. Haven't had to feed as much, haven't had to pay as much staff.
Yep, thanks, Joe. We've got 2 questions here about using powdered lime in disinfecting the shed, and I would I would say that's very effective. So lime will increase the pH, and bacteria don't like a high pH. So lime down before you bed up works well in disinfecting. Do either of you have any other top tips for shed disinfection? Okay.
Be careful. Oh, sorry, Joe, you go on.
No, after you.
I was going to say, be careful. Certainly, there are some very effective water-based disinfectants, but be careful with application, because obviously anything that creates a damp environment potentially then obviously leads to further bacterial growth. So I'm not saying they're ineffective, but if you are going to use them very carefully and to the manufacturer's instructions, so things aren't being saturated and therefore not drying out and potentially creating other problems. So certainly, I quite like the powder disinfectants because they do change the pH, but they also, a lot of them are desiccants. They dry things out as well. So that would be my main thing, is certainly, with whatever you're using, be careful with it and use it appropriately, but especially the water-based disinfectants.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing, certainly if the straw's not that dry, I'm quite a big fan of pine chips, wood chips, rather than straw for bedding the pens, because I think it's generally uniformly drier, and dry environments worse for bacteria, basically.
Yeah, and you're not alone. Yes, I know a number of people who really go for the wood shavings, pine shavings particularly, and those comment all of that. If we're talking about joint till, so we did notice from that graph, if a quarter of people are worried about watery mouth, a quarter of farmers are worried more about joint till, and so very quickly, joint till is almost at least 60-70% of the time, joint ill that we see in lambs at point of lambing is caused by this bug Streptococcus galactii, and virtually anything can cause that to get into the lamb. So the lamb might pick it up from the birth canal, or from the teats, or from the stomach tube or bottle teat. So there's a question here about best way to disinfect tubes. Tubes very definitely need disinfecting. I would put a kid's baby bottle sterilizer, or make sure kettle's boiled. But the number of lambing sheds you go into, and there's like tubes, feeding tubes, are just lying around or on a windowsill or something like that, that if we can sterilize them between every lamb, that will make a big difference. Whichever the carrier U is for the joint till, if this lamb is being coated, you then don't want that to spread to all your other lambs. That could be in your bike trailer as you take them out to the field, or it could be on your dirty hands as you've lambed her and then gone straight on and passed that to another one. So hygiene is really, really important to prevent joint till, and anything that breaks the skin will potentially cause joint till to get into the blood of the lamb and settle in the joints, or cause a peritonitis inside the abdomen. So with joint till, it's just the same. Make sure you plan ahead, go through absolutely everything, and if you get your vets in, literally to go through everything with a fine tooth comb, because each one of us will say it's not always the same thing on every farm, because we've got a number of different bases we have to cover to work out where the joint ill, where the main problem is. So absolutely stringent hygiene is really important. Sterilizing all this equipment, using gloves, cleaning hands. Where necessary, your vet might prescribe antibiotics, but it is only where necessary. And it definitely does not mean that we do need to use antibiotics every lamb in future years. And I know there are farms, quite a number of flocks, where they have historically had a joint till problem, and they're still using antibiotics, injectable antibiotics in every lamb, because they're frightened. And we absolutely know, this is a flock I know very well, a colleague of mine, they've had joint till issues, dealt with it, sorted it out in that group, and they do not go on and give antibiotics every year. That is not the answer. So that's and it brings us on to naval treatments, which are important. And we know, or we have heard, that there is an issue with iodine potentially this year particularly, so it may be very expensive. So and actually, we know in recent years there have been a number of iodines on the market which have not been decent 10% BP, good iodine. A brown liquid that has some iodine in it is not necessarily good enough for treating lambs' navels. So the key, most important thing is that the navel dries very quickly. And so this 10% iodine will have some sort of alcohol in there to really dry the navel quickly. If you can't get hold of iodine, there are other options. There are a number of different products, and you can go into the merchant or the vets and speak about various products available. It is very, very important that you know what's in there and that you see it dries the navel quickly. We've been asked over the last few weeks, I keep getting asked about the dose of copper sulfate. So some people, particularly in the West Country, use copper sulfate solution. And we've got a PhD looking at the use of metals to kill bacteria at the moment. 1% is definitely above the MIC that kills bacteria, and it should be safe. It's not necessarily safe if you've got Texel ewes who are susceptible to copper. You have got to be really, really careful with copper. But and you don't want to splash it on yourself or anything, but 1% is safe and it should kill the bacteria, but it doesn't necessarily dry, and I have seen problems with it in a lambing shed because the navels haven't dried quickly. So that is the most important thing, is dry the navel, and to make sure it's properly covered all round. It's not just straight on, just a spray. You know, that's why some people will recommend you dip in it. Oh, that was my last slide, but we have got a number of questions still to go, so I'll leave that up. Well, actually, I'll leave this jointal question up, and there's a question here about whether you should dry the navel to put the iodine on. The idea is the iodine is mixed with alcohol, which will dry it itself. I wouldn't dry the navel. I mean, there's no problem drying the navel with a clean paper towel. What you definitely don't want is a mucky hand towel that gets passed between them. So the product itself should dry the navel. What do you think of a hand disinfectant for humans? Okay, so somebody here using a hand disinfectant in replacing for navel disinfection. I would argue that we're doing two things. We're both desiccating, drying out the navel, and killing the bacteria, and we need to do both of those for navel treatments to work. Copper sulfate is not prescribed. It's a disinfectant. You can purchase copper sulfate, just be very cautious. It's not a treatment, it's an antiseptic disinfectant. I'm just trying to go through the questions that we've got here. Do you recommend routine use of antibiotics for ewes when you've had to intervene in lambing? Do either of you two want to answer that? Did you hear the question?
Yeah, routinely, no. It's very, very case by case dependent. It depends on the level of intervention and I suppose the outcome. You know, if you've had to scrabble around and pull out some revolting rotten lambs, then yes, I probably would. If it's been a clean glove, you know, one person, a clean glove, and perhaps a little bit of untangling and pulling out, then no, not necessarily. I think yes, the main answer is no, not routinely, very case by case dependent. Certain cases it will be appropriate, but for the majority of them, especially if it's been quite an easy lambing and done hygienically, then no.
I think I would agree with that. And I think in the old days, we would always say, if you put your hand in, then give a dose of antibiotic. And I personally think that was unnecessary. If you've been good and clean, you don't need to. Any comments, Joe?
Just the same, really. It depends on the level of the lambing. You know, if it's just one of these that's stuck at a Superman position, just needs the feet popped and you've got a glove on, absolutely not. if you've got to do any sort of guddling about and getting heads back and things like that, and you're going in quite deep, then potentially yes. But it's you know, I think it's very important firstly to use gloves. You know, there's still a lot of people not using long gloves at lambing time, and you can just soon spread a lot of infection from you to you. That's what used to kill loads of women back in the day, midwives and stuff and people, but it's just the same in sheep.
Yep, thank you. There's a comment here about someone being very thorough, dipping tags before application, dipping the tags in alcohol before application. I would absolutely concur with that. It's hideous to think that we might be putting in ear tags without disinfecting first, both the tag and the ear itself, because we're injecting any bacteria into the system. And so I would agree that be very, very cautious, especially, you know, tags on dusty windowsills, brilliant way to spread Streptococci. So I would definitely agree with that. Now there's a few people with the recipes. I would not mix white spirit with iodine to speed up drying, because there's toxins in white spirit. Is a paint stripper, isn't it? I think surgical spirit potentially. Do be really cautious. So some people go 50-50 with a surgical spirit or an alcohol base and iodine, but I'm not sure I would use a white spirit. Somebody asked about umbilical clamps. Have either of you two got personal experience of using umbilical not personal, but you know what I mean, in your lambs?
I haven't actually. I'm not aware of any of our farmers using them.
That's a couple of our farmers used to use them years ago, but haven't done for years and years.
There was somebody with a demonstration at the Sheep Vet Society of umbilical clamps, and it was very convincing. But I personally haven't got. I thought it looked very logical, and they told a good. You know, there was some good evidence there, but I don't have personal experience of using umbilical clamps. Right, we've got a few questions here about using powdered colostrum. So I would 100% go for the use own colostrum and anything you can harvest off your ewes, and making sure you have plenty of colostrum so there is some to harvest, and then storing that. I would say that is 100% better than anything else. I would then put a goat or cow colostrum as next best. So cow colostrum is very high in immunoglobulins. It's not as good as in protein, pure protein, as sheep, but for immunoglobulins it's about twice as good. It's less energy than sheep, so you need to give a bit more, particularly if you're lambing outside and you really need the colostrum for good energy to prevent hypothermia. Then you need to give a bit extra in cow colostrum, and you need to mix colostrum from more than one cow, because there are odd cows which have anti-sheep factor in their colostrum, and that will cause anemia in lambs. So personally, I would go for cow colostrum over powdered colostrum. If you have to use powdered colostrum, that to me is the my least favourite, and there is a massive range in what's out there, and your vets can access the vet record, where there was a study just last year looking at some powdered colostrum is better than others, and even the best of the powder is only half as good as a use own colostrum, so it's definitely worth bearing that in mind. Somebody asked if the date on powdered colostrum is important, and yeah, it's the cell used by date's always important. Possibly less so for powdered colostrum, but I wouldn't advise anyone use anything past the date. Any comments on powdered colostrum, Gina or Joe?
Nothing really that you've not answered. I mean, I'd agree that certainly I wouldn't be using stuff that's out of date. I imagine the protein that is available in powdered colostrum, you know, probably does deteriorate, you know, after the sell by date. So especially as powdered colostrum is, as Fiona said, is not the best to start with. Certainly you want to be giving the best powdered colostrum you can, which includes it being in date, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is, use stuff is the best, especially if you use off your farm, because they'll have the immunity to the bugs on your farm. So that's like, you know, double win whenever you buy powdered. It's sort of generic immunity, as it were. But having said that, if powdered colostrum is easy, and if it's the middle of the night and you've got triplets, then if it's a choice between not supplementing colostrum or supplementing colostrum, I would supplement with powdered rather than nothing at all.
But that's as well why, you know, sort of as we were talking about earlier, storing good quality colostrum from your own farm can be incredibly helpful. You know, if in the first couple of weeks of lambing, or the first week of lambing, you've got a ewe either that has dead lambs or that has, you know, a lot of colostrum, taking some of that off and storing it, so it's there, you know, readily available. I always recommend freezing colostrum in Ziploc bags, so it's very, very thin, so you can defrost it quickly. But with, you know, you mustn't defrost colostrum in boiling hot water or in a microwave or anything, because it will sort of kill the proteins and the goodness that's in there. But freezing it in either a you know, like a Chinese takeaway tub in a thin layer, or in a plastic bag that can be sort of the air pushed out and very thin, means you can defrost it very quickly. And it, you know, if available, it's always good to have a stash of stored colostrum for those occasions as well.
Yep. And in terms of quantity, a few questions about quantity of colostrum. So it's 50 mils per kilogram of lamb. So if we imagine we've got a 4 kilogram lamb at birth, needs 200 mils of colostrum within the first 2 hours, and a further 150 mils per kilogram of lamb, 200 mils per kilogram of lamb, which multiplies up to about 6, 7, 8 mils. It's a lot of colostrum. By the end of 24 hours, we're virtually up to a litre of colostrum. It is a huge amount, which is one of the reasons I quite like a hand pump, because you can pull a lot of colostrum off of you. It's more than most people give. Somebody says, can they store colostrum from one season to the next? And frozen colostrum, definitely. So colostrum will last for a week when it's fresh in the fridge. If you're going to freeze it, that's fine. And if you've got frozen colostrum from last year, I wouldn't keep it over one's, you know, 2 seasons. But if it's certainly quite highly likely to have more immunoglobulins in it than powdered colostrum. I would not dilute down a used colostrum unless I'd taken it on the bricks and I knew it was well over the scale on the bricks, which is 30 degrees. Generally speaking, I would not dilute it down. Sometimes we get ewe colostrum, that really thick, waxy, very, very thick. That's not the best colostrum to be giving. It's hard to cover all these questions, actually. Where if we go back to iodine, someone's suggesting mixing formalin and iodine together. Personally, I wouldn't put formalin in it, so it would dry it out, but formalin is carcinogenic, and I would not use formalin mixing my iodine. And somebody else asked if treating a navel twice is necessary if you're using decent 10% iodine. Usually people can get away with only treating the navel once. If you've got a serious joint till problem, actually I'm just going to stop showing that. If then sometimes we do suggest treating the navel twice, 6 hours apart. If you need to treat twice, just check that what you're using is definitely 10% BP and it's definitely drying the navels out. But yeah, treating twice, 6 hours apart is quite a good method if you're treating with an effective product and you've still got joint issues. But you also need to be looking at all these other things such as tagging, docking. You know, I would disinfect rubber rings that I'm using for docking or castrating, and I would disinfect ear tags, as somebody always said. Now, these are all reasons for potentially joint ill. how else are we doing with questions? I think we've done minimum amounts of, yes, I would disinfect rubber rings and I'd put them in alcohol or surgical spirit. Somebody asked, if we use having 4 lambs, should we be giving probiotic? Quite honestly, with probiotic, I personally don't think the data is there. I would prefer to give, make sure you've got good colostrum into the lambs far more than a probiotic. Far more important. Thick and sticky colostrum. Thick colostrum's fine. It's just when it's really waxy and there isn't enough. Sometimes it's that they've not got enough to drink. So giving buckets of water immediately after lambing, but also sometimes it's volume, which is restricted when you've got very thick colostrum, very, very thick, so you can't actually strip it out. So we do want colostrum to be thicker, and that shows that we've got good protein in the diet. But if you've got it so thick and waxy that you can't draw it out, then that's a volume thing, and that might be an energy in the diet thing, or it might be lack of water. So it's not necessarily bad, but it can be bad if it means that we've got low volume, I'd suggest. What disinfectant would you use for tubes and air tags? Milton Fine, anything you're treating babies' bottles with, Milton, boil it up. Somebody here is saying they use Vetricin Super 7 for navels and they really like it. There are a number of different products. As long as it's disinfecting and it's drying out, that's great. And what would you recommend to clean and air pre-tagging? I would use surgical spirit and I would swab it with that on a clean swab. Don't know if either of you two have got want to disagree with anything I say, please jump in. It's quite hard to go through questions this quickly. Okay, what's your view on using rubber rings on lambs under 12 hours old? Is there a risk of infection later when the tails and purse fall off? There is a risk of infection when we've, and there is a risk with rubber rings generally. I would definitely disinfect them beforehand. I would definitely consider whether there are some lambs that you do not need to put rings on. You know, whether they're either lambs that you're going to be selling early and you can sell with tails on, or before the castration if they're going to finish quickly. In terms of using them under 12 hours old, what are your views on that, Joe and Gina?
I'm not sure it's a great idea in terms of interrupting them getting colostrum, so I tend to say leave them 12 hours before you do anything like that. Yeah,
I think that's fair. The most important thing, I don't, has it come across? We really think colostrum is hugely important, and anything you do that prevents that mother-ewe bond and the lamb getting adequate colostrum is, you know, you want to do as little as possible to upset that that colostrum. Good belly full of colostrum. I'm not going to, there are a couple of questions that are slightly off the topic of neonatal lambs. And although there is one here about how long does a dose of antibiotics stay in the lamb system? No antibiotic that we give to neonatal lambs, at least, would be in there for longer than a single dose, 24, 48 hours at the most, would you suggest? Yeah, but in the time, any antibiotic has wiped out the normal biome and potentially upset the bacterial balance biome in the lamb system. So it won't stay in there for a long time, but it potentially will cause a long time's worth of effect in terms of upsetting both the balance of bacteria. Emma, would you say we've answered enough of these questions?
Absolutely. I think we could be here all night if we answered them all, but I would just like to thank everyone for participating. I think we've got really good numbers and some really good questions. And thank you to Fiona, Gina and Joe for a brilliant presentation, especially so late on in the evening, and for answering all the questions that have been posed. If you do have any follow-up questions, I think we could all agree that we'd point you in the direction of your own vet, who I'm sure would be more than happy to help and give their own advice to your specific flocks and needs. This webinar has been recorded, so it will be available on the NSA website for you to watch back. But yeah, thank you everyone for your time tonight, and I think we'll leave it there.
Great. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Joe. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you.